Informal transit is the workhorse of public transit in many large and emerging cities throughout the world. Informal transit, or transit modes that are not planned citywide by a municipal authority, account for about 50% of all transit in many cities in many parts of the globe, especially in Africa, Latin America, and some parts of Asia. And the role of informal transit's only going to grow. 90% of urban growth between now and 2050 will likely be in Africa and Asia, places that already have quite a bit of informal transit. So today, we're going to explore informal transit. What is it exactly? What are the pros and cons? And what, if anything, should we do to improve it? Welcome to Transit World, weekly videos on all things transportation, with a focus on the developing world. So before I get into the topic at hand, I just want to note that most of this video is based on a couple of different published papers on the topic. Much of the research for this video specifically comes from work that's been produced from the World Resources Institute, which is an international NGO that studies these kinds of things. They're certainly not the only source on the topic, but they are one of the major ones, and they're also the only one that I used to work for. So most of the papers I'll reference in this video, especially the top 3 or so, were authored by well-established experts in the field, but some did include some second-class amateurs as well. So what exactly is informal transit? Simply put, informal transit is public transportation services that are predominantly owned and operated by the private sector with little to no oversight or enforcement or regulation from the government. Informal transit networks are typically characterized by service that does follow well-established routes, but has less established actual station locations. It's also characterized by vehicles of various sizes, usually smaller vehicles, such as minibuses, shared taxis, shared autos, and whatnot. But it could also include larger buses that approach the conventional size that we see in most quote-unquote formal systems. Informal transit typically has flexible schedules with higher frequencies during peak periods than conventional transit does. In some parts of the world, especially Africa, the word paratransit is used in place of informal transit because informal transit can be seen as a bit of a derogatory term. Informal transit to some can seem to be a little offensive because it makes it sound like it's chaotic, disorganized, or like a city that embraces informal transit has a type of system that might be inferior to a city that has a more conventional formal system. So I did want to acknowledge this from the beginning, but given that paratransit is a term that refers to something that's dramatically different in North America, I am going to stick, at least for the purposes of keeping things simple in this video, to the term informal transit. It's not always clear where you draw the line between formal and informal transit. And in fact, really all the kind of different ways that transit can be owned, operated, and regulated fall on a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you have full government control, where the government completely owns, operates, and regulates all aspects of transit. On the very end of the other side of the spectrum, you have absolutely no government ownership, operation, or oversight. At this side of the spectrum, you certainly have something that would be termed informal transit, but there is quite a bit of debate and ambiguity on exactly how far you can slide towards the center and still be in the quote-unquote informal transit spectrum. Informal transit truly does exist all over the world. Much of it, yes, is indeed located in Africa, Latin America, and in some parts of South and Southeast Asia. But informal transit is not just relegated to the developing world. You can also see informal transit filling transit gaps outside of the global South, including places like New York with their dollar van system. You can also potentially make the argument that services like Uber Pool or Lyft Line or other types of micromobility are all forms of some sort of informal transit as well. At a very minimum, these are public services that fill gaps in the formal transit network, which are quite similar to the exact reasons that informal transit exists. So how does informal transit come to be? Informal transit can occur due to deliberate deregulation, such as was the case in Chile in the 1970s, but usually it's the unplanned result of weak government institutions which do not adequately supply or manage public transportation. Sometimes cities have never had quote-unquote formal transport. In some cases, cities did have formalized systems decades ago, but those have really just fallen apart and never existed since the rise of the personal automobiles at the beginning of the earliest 20th century. Some cities, you could make the argument, have an ever-changing mix of formal and informal transit. Let's jump into some of the pros and cons. So I think that there's essentially three major cons for having an informal transit system. The first is low-quality user experiences and safety issues. Informal transit typically uses rolling stock, which is either old and/or in disrepair. When you combine unregulated or only loosely regulated vehicles with thin margins, bus owners really have no incentive and low ability to pay for preventative maintenance and to invest in newer and cleaner buses. So you typically see lax maintenance, where you'll only fix things when it is essential to be able to continue your service. Not only does this have safety and comfort implications, but it also has emissions implications throughout a city. In Bogota, for example, before they implemented their Transmilenio system, buses accounted for only 5% of all the vehicles in the city, but were responsible for 23% of all of the CO2, 55% of all the PM10, and 40% of all the NOx vehicle emissions on the routes that they covered. Another reason you have low quality user experiences is because these buses are often overcrowded. Typically, these buses carry more people than the vehicle was originally designed to carry. You may see buses where they added seats in areas that were originally only intended for storage or for access and egress, or sometimes a driver will simply instruct patrons to sit either on the floor or on top of a wheel well. Another reason informal transit sometimes has low quality user experiences is because there's no protections or regulations for the drivers. In fact, the drivers are encouraged to drive long hours and to drive aggressively, since the only real incentive they have is to collect as many passenger fares as possible in the smallest amount of time. This is bad for safety and health, both for the drivers as well as for the passengers. The second major con for informal transit is an inability to have a robust network that's planned. Informal services typically lack an integrated transit system. They lack the ability and really desire to create and integrate a holistic transit system with coordinated routes, schedules, free transfers, discounted rate for select populations. There's really just none of that, or at least it's very hard and there are minimal elements in most informal services. It's also typically hard to understand where, when, and at what price the service will operate. Most informal services don't have system maps or posted bus stops, and in some cases the vehicles themselves don't even say where they're going. There's also an element of unpredictability in the prices and service levels. Different drivers can and often do charge different rates depending on the time of day and demand. The span and frequency of service is quite variable, since drivers really decide when they want to drive and when they want to stop. So this can make it really hard to plan your trip, especially if we're talking about a route which has low service levels in general. Overall, it can be generally hard to navigate these systems if you're not already really familiar with the service. And even then, it can be difficult to know when something changes. Informal systems also commonly lack accountability. You don't really have anywhere to go if you want to complain about the system. So if you as the passenger feels like you've experienced price gouging or have experienced a refusal to be picked up based on some sort of discriminatory practice, or want to report unsafe driving or vehicle conditions, you don't really have anywhere to redress those complaints. And the third con for an informal transit system is that coverage is often asymmetrical. In almost every city in the world, transportation by its very nature is going to have a large degree of asymmetry. There's always going to be just a handful of routes that account for the bulk of the ridership for the entire city. And with informal systems, this often results in an oversupply of buses on the high demand corridors, which can congest the major roadways. Other routes that are not profitable, or even just not as profitable as the preferred routes, get little to no service. Coverage is a really complicated topic, since informal transit actually can have some benefits over formal transits in terms of covering routes that are in newly developed locations or that are physically difficult to drive large vehicles in. So we'll discuss this more when we get to the pros. So in summary, when looking at the cons, informal transit creates an inefficient, oversupplied, low quality, and unaccountable transit system. Before we get to the pros, just a quick shameless plug to please like and subscribe to this video if you're enjoying the content. So how are these informal transit systems actually beneficial? Well, I think there are three major ways. The first is that they are free to the city to operate. There's no need to deal with public pressure to operate at 100% fare box recovery ratio, which is typically what cities promise to do when they're trying to replace their informal systems, and pretty much never accomplish. The reason for this is that the city, when they adopt the system, they essentially improve it, and that comes at the expense of profit. So if you're not actually running the system and you let it stay in the informal sector, the city doesn't need to manage or pay for administration of new services, try to connect the network better, or ensure quality levels broadly are improving. A second big pro of having an informal transit system is that it's able to fulfill quite well transportation gaps that otherwise wouldn't be covered by conventional formalized transit. There are several markets that informal transits can enter where conventional transits cannot or will not go. So, for example, there are certain routes where there's low demand for full-size buses, but there would be sufficient demand for the smaller vehicles that often dominate informal transit services. There's also just physical limitations sometimes to trying to get a bus through a street grid network. And so informal transit can be really good on streets that are hard to navigate in larger vehicles. Informal transit also can adopt quickly to provide service to new developments because there's no additional infrastructure needed for them to change their operation profile, and they can try it out if they want for a few times and revert back if it's not profitable. They don't really have any sunk costs to start and to promote new service. Also, even on corridors that do have decent conventional service, informal transit can offer a larger variety of service levels, different price points, and different route options to supplement some of those formal services that may travel on the same corridors. And the third big advantage of informal systems is that they typically have insanely frequent service, at least on the most critical routes during the high demand hours. Informal transit in many cities is nearly ubiquitous. Typically, if you're going on a heavily traveled corridor, you're only going to wait at most a few minutes. Informal transit inherently has better frequency than formal service, simply just because there's a lot more vehicles traveling down any given corridor. This has its own disadvantages as it relates to congestion and emissions, but there's no denying that it provides just incredibly frequent service. In fact, informal transit systems, even in medium-sized cities, often rival or surpass the frequency that you have even with the best metro systems in the world. All right, well, those are the pros and cons. So of course, the big question still is informal transit something that's good? Should it be embraced? Should it be changed? Should it be eradicated? Well, there's been a really big trend in thinking on this topic over time. Originally, informal transit was seen mostly as something that you really just needed to replace. Now, more and more considerations are putting more emphasis on embracing it and trying to figure out how to make some elements of it better without really, quote unquote, formalizing it. So historically, in the latter part of the 20th century, many cities, especially in Latin America, attempted to formalize their bus systems to create a governed, integrated transit network. A lot of cities initiated these formalization processes around the implementation of a bus rapid transit system. And so, for example, in Latin America right now, there are 37 cities that have BRT systems, and many of those projects were used indeed as a catalyst to formalize their transportation. In some cases, this was just to formalize transit along a certain corridor or area of the city, such as in Mexico City or Guadalajara, León, Lima. But it's also been used as a catalyst for system-wide reform in some cities, such as in Bogota, Brasilia, and Cali. But even more recently, there's been a little bit more of a shift towards efforts towards simply improving the system that's already in place. One example of this are efforts to simply just map the informal transit. This has been especially important in many cities in Africa. So cities like Abidjan, Addis Ababa, a couple of different cities in South Africa and Sudan, Accra in Ghana, Egypt, and perhaps most famous of all of them, Nairobi with the Digital Matatus project, have undergone different projects to try to digitize the amount of mapping information that's available to the general public. And there's been some really kind of creative and innovative ways that different cities have gone about trying to do this. Admittedly, there's been different levels of success with these mapping initiatives, but in Nairobi with the Digital Matatus project, they actually became the first and only sub-Saharan African city to have their entire formal transit system routed into Google Maps. And outside of this mapping initiative, in Nairobi, as well as in other parts of Africa, there's been efforts to try to have informal but effective collaboration take place in a new light between those that operate routes and the government. In 2015 in Kampala, for example, government officials and city planners were able to successfully work for the first time with a minibus association to expand service to a neighborhood, not just for commercial profitability reasons, but also from an equity perspective, trying to make that argument successfully and winning a new route with the help of the government. So a couple of final thoughts. I really don't think there's any clear-cut answer to the question of how to proceed with an informal transit system in any given city. And I really do think the recommendation depends a lot on the local conditions of the city. Is the city willing to subsidize the system and be public about the fact that this is not going to be free if the system becomes more formalized? Are the passengers in the city willing to sacrifice headways for better coverage and for better comfort? How easy or hard is it to get existing operators on board with the changes, both from an operational perspective, but then also from a political perspective? But whether informal transit is something to fix or manage or just champion for what it is, informal transit is how many people in the world get around, and it's something that's worth paying attention to. That's it for today. Thanks again for taking a look through this video. If you happen to like the content, I would certainly appreciate your like and subscription. And if you want, you can even go check out my Patreon account if you're really into what we're doing here. That's it for now. Talk to you later.